Chairman McCaul, thank you for being here. As Fred said, you've been staunch in defending American interests as we deal with an aggressive Russia, an aggressive China, and North Korea and Iran. Okay, Moscow's been waging this war in Ukraine for 10 years. Their big invasion began almost 3 years ago. The U.S. has provided substantial military and economic support to Ukraine since the big invasion. What are the U.S. interests in this war, and why are we engaged?
It's a great question. I get asked that quite a bit from my colleagues. I want to thank the Atlantic Council for inviting me in your new facility. It's beautiful, and my good friend, the ambassador from Ukraine. We've been through a lot together the past couple. It's vitally important. I have to remind some of my colleagues about history, 1930s. A lot of parallels today between 1939 and today. A lot of them didn't grow up in the Cold War. I did. Russia was not our friend. They were our enemy, an adversary. They still are today. You call it an axis. I call it unholy alliance that Chairman Xi and Putin made at the Beijing Olympics 2 weeks before the invasion into Ukraine. We knew it would happen after Afghanistan fell. We saw the satellite imagery of the Russian Federation moving towards Ukraine, and we warned the world about that. And it, obviously, it did happen. Why is it important, though? I believe if you get into Putin's head, that his legacy is very important. He envisions himself as like a Peter the Great. Restoration of the Russian Empire is important to him. He was in Berlin when the wall fell and thought that his leadership betrayed him. That would be Mr. Gorbachev and then Yeltsin. He has great animosity towards them, and he feels it's his responsibility to reclaim what is rightly Russia's. Ukraine's always been the breadbasket of Russia. It's always been the prize of Russia. Stalin, obviously, exploited that. 8 million Ukrainians died. We had Chernobyl. We had the Budapest Agreement that was then violated. Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal. No enforcement mechanism. Ukraine's been the victim for quite some time. But I have to say, is the United States' posture in the world stronger or weaker if we allow Mr. Putin to invade and take over all of Ukraine? I think it's weaker. We're projecting weakness, not strength. That would invite more aggression from Mr. Putin. It also impacts Chairman Xi and his calculus looking at Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific. Moldova would certainly fall within a day, as would Georgia. And then all of Eastern Europe would be under the threat and the dark cloud of Russian aggression. So therefore, if past is prologue, if we could have stopped Hitler in 1939, my dad wouldn't have had to participate in that war. And I think the goals are similar in this case. And I think when you go to Ukraine, they say, we're fighting for you, so you don't have to fight this war. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. They are fighting this conflict for us, and it's our moral obligation and responsibility to stop aggression where it exists, to defend freedom and democracy against what is becoming now between Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, a very formidable adversary alliance of the unholy alliance that I call.
Thank you. You know, you don't need to just point to the past. Just remind those who don't understand our interests here that every day Putin or someone seen in Moscow describes the U.S. as Russia's principal adversary and act that way. You've already described what would happen if Russia succeeded, if Putin succeeded in Ukraine. You talked about in terms of Europe. But you've mentioned, Fred mentioned, and anyone who could look at the geopolitical scene understands, we do face increasing cooperation by our four foes, right? Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran. Some people argue that China is our most dangerous adversary, and therefore we should direct all of our geopolitical efforts to the Western Pacific. However, the leaders of Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea say, if we want to deter a Chinese attack on Taiwan, make sure Putin loses in Ukraine. How do you see this?
Well, I mean, don't take my word for it. I met with the Japanese ambassador from Japan and the National Security Advisor. Every Asian country I talked to, whether it be Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, the Indo-Pacific region, they all see it the same way, that what happens in Ukraine impacts Chairman Xi's calculus as to whether he will invade Taiwan. I do think China is the greater threat, the great power competition, AI warfare, the Indo-China, Indo-Pacific conflict could result in, when you look at a World War III analysis, that is the one I worry the most about. We have two hot zones, and they're all tied together. You can't separate the Ayatollah from Putin. Putin invited Hamas to the Kremlin right after October the 7th. The alliance between Xi and Putin is clear. North Korea has now sent 10,000 troops into the conflict. So all these four dictators, we don't choose our enemies, they choose us. And when I gave my closing argument on the floor, it was, do you want to be, think about this vote, because it's historical, and do you want to be remembered as Chamberlain or Churchill? Because that, at the end of the day, is the decision that we had to make. There were a lot of courageous members that did the right thing. There were members who were afraid of their own shadows. But you know what? We didn't get the blowback that everybody said we were going to get when we went back home. In fact, I had more people say thank you for standing up against Putin and what he's trying to do. And so I don't know if that answered all of your question, but again, I view them all in this together. You really can't separate them. You can't say, gee, I'm against communist China, but I kind of like Putin and Russia, because they're allies.
You're right. And some folks who oppose our policy of supporting Ukraine are all in for supporting Israel, which is good, but then they deny the connection between Russia and Iran. And of course, when the Israeli forces went into southern Lebanon, they found huge stocks of Russian weapons controlled by Hezbollah. Okay. The Biden administration just lifted, finally, restrictions on Ukraine's ability to use our ATACMS against targets in Russia. Something which you have advocated for not just months, but first you advocated for years that they get the ATACMS and then without restriction. At this late date, when many Russian military assets have been moved out of the range of these missiles, and again, these long strikes only go 180 miles, right? So they don't go deep into Russia the way people say. What will be the impact of this decision?
The impact, well, better late than never. But I'll take you back to the very beginning of the conflict.
Please.
My frustration with the administration has been the slow walking of these defense articles that we promised we would deliver to Ukraine, and yet, it started with the Javelins, the Stingers, then the HIMARS. For those of you who don't know, it's another launching of a missile, F-16s to tanks. Finally, the ATACMS, that's a long-range artillery. Look, I empathize with President Zelensky and the ambassador. They can't really bite the hand that feeds them. So I become the advocate and say things that maybe they can't say diplomatically. But it is, do not tie our hands behind our back. That's not a way to win a war. You're either all in or you're out. And I think history has always taught us that. If we're only halfway in this thing, you get into a stalemate, and if you get into a stalemate, Russia wins. So give them everything they need now, that was 2 years ago, to win this fight. We were told to be over in 5 days. The Ukrainians proved us wrong. And when the resilience of the Ukrainian soldiers and the citizen soldiers, I should say, and the toughness of this fight is why I think the will and determination of the Ukrainians is far stronger than the cannon fodder that Russia puts on its front lines, which is why I'm optimistic. I've always been optimistic about this conflict, but I have not been optimistic about the slowness of the weapons. What we've seen now with the threat of ATACMS now is that Russia is now receding it's weapons. These glide bombers are coming across. Most of this is in the Kursk region. That's where the 10,000 North Koreans are. I got a briefing yesterday. That is where the strongest part of the fighting is, and that's where the ATACMS will be used, and they will be very effective because it will not just be air defense. It will be projecting strength across border at Russia, so they will have to retreat. Why is that important? You know, I know that the president-elect had met with Putin and said, please do not escalate. He has not taken the president-elect's advice. In fact, what we're seeing is almost a counteroffensive now. And Ukraine, I believe, needs these ATACMS because if and when the moment happens where a ceasefire is declared and a negotiation takes place, Ukraine has to be in the strongest possible position with the most leverage to get the best negotiation at the table. Right now, they're not there because of the slowness of Jake Sullivan and the National Security Council in delivering these weapons. Now that they have the ATACMS, I hope, and Kursk was actually Russian. Putin does not like that at all. And so I think the more they can push the Russians out, the better the map's going to look at the end of the day.
There have been some critics, including from the Republican Party, who claim that this provision of this authority to the Ukrainians is going to make it harder for President Trump to succeed, or incoming President Trump to succeed with his peace initiative. Any thoughts on that?
I disagree.
Explain why, please.
Maybe I'm in the minority in my party now. I don't know. I always ask the question, what would Reagan do? To my Republican colleagues, what would Ronald Reagan do? The guy that brought down the Soviet Union, and now we have these pro-Putin, Russian-loving people. I don't understand it. I think just the contrary. Because the ATACMS can be used, the better leverage at the table Ukraine will have in the negotiating process. Without the ATACMS, they wouldn't have that position of leverage. Better late than never. I wish it was sooner. But if you look at the real leadership in the House on national security, it is the three national security committees. So the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Turner, agrees with me, and the chairman of the Armed Services Committee, Mike Rogers. They call us the three Mikes. And then we have Mike Johnson, the speaker. So I remember talking to Mike Johnson the eve before he made his heroic decision to move forward with Ukraine aid. I said, at the end of the day, it's not your district. It's not even the United States. It's the world that your decision will impact. And I said, Mr. Speaker, you want to be on the right side of history. And that's what I appeal. History will judge us at this moment in time. And what side of history do you want to be judged on? And I truly believe that we're on the right side.
You mentioned that Putin wants to, in effect, restore Moscow's control over the entire post-Soviet space. And you can even say the entire space of the Warsaw Pact, which takes care of a bunch of new NATO members. If that's true, and I think it is with you, then it would seem to me the only way President Trump could have a peace agreement which ensures Ukraine's survival, which he said is important to the United States, whereas others in his party have not said that, is to give Ukraine leverage. Would you agree with that?
I agree. And let's go. What was Putin's goal? It was to divide and weaken NATO. Just the opposite occurred. It's now more united than it's ever been, and it's stronger than it's ever. With the ascension of Sweden and Finland, two great superpowers, if you will, in terms of military, the strength they bring to NATO is phenomenal. So now Putin is seeing that what he did is actually not working the way he had planned. I would say that he is the one losing, not Ukraine. But we can't allow Ukraine to fall. I think President Trump's right about this. I still believe he has voices in his head, in his ear, like myself, like Mr. Waltz, who was on my committee, like Rubio, like Mike Pompeo, and Robert O'Brien, and like-minded, people are probably more back from the Reagan era, that we can't afford to lose this fight. And it's vital to our national interests, because if Ukraine falls, Taiwan is next, and that would be World War III.
If you want peace, prepare for war.
Projected strength.
That's right.
Reagan, it's an axiom that's historically correct. I mean, project strength to get peace, project weakness, you invite conflict, aggression, and war.
Okay, thank you. Coming back to the peace initiative, which President-elect Trump keeps discussing. While the key elements of the plan are obviously not public, we have certain indications. For example, Ukraine making some territorial compromise, perhaps a demilitarized zone between Russian and Ukrainian troops, perhaps in that zone, European forces, perhaps arming Ukraine substantially so Russia doesn't dare attack after this peace agreement. Almost every voice we've heard from Russia has essentially rejected these things. How do you see this negotiation playing out, given these circumstances?
I think it'd be very difficult. I know that President-elect Trump envisions himself as the great negotiator. I think Putin is a very, very smart, clever man. Don't ever underestimate him. Wants KGB always. He wants all of Ukraine. That's rightfully his in his mind. And it's rightfully part of Russia. It's the breadbasket. I find it very hard to negotiate that. And by the same token, very difficult for President Zelensky to acquiesce the Donbass and Crimea without having a revolution on his hands after everything they've gone through. So I think this negotiation is not going to be easy. I think it'll be very, very hard on both sides. But whatever, if a negotiation is finalized, my strongest advice is to put teeth into the agreement and put an enforcement mechanism. As you know, the greatest sin and weakness of the Budapest Agreement, which took all the deterrence away from Ukraine to give up all their nuclear weapons, had no enforcement mechanism, so that when they gave all their weapons up, what happened after that? Then Russia moved into the Donbass and Crimea with no enforcement, and we betrayed Ukraine. The world stage, NATO, betrayed Ukraine at that moment. So if ever a negotiation's entered into again, you have to have enforcement.
Good, okay. You mentioned NATO. Obviously, the great peace that we've enjoyed since the end of World War II, and the great power war, perhaps is due to NATO more than anything else, and American power properly applied globally. NATO is the core as we face, as you call them, the unholy alliance. But what we've seen over the past 6 and 7 months is a much larger Russian sabotage campaign in NATO countries, in Europe, but also, if we believe the Wall Street Journal, they were going to put bombs on DHL planes coming here and coming to Canada. That's one. That's been going on since April, say. And over the last 2.5 months, we've seen fairly regular violations of NATO airspace, Russian missiles and drones on their way to deliver their packages to Ukraine. NATO has done nothing against either of these provocations. What should NATO do? What should the incoming administration do about this?
I think the strong warnings that if you continue this behavior, you'll invoke Article 5 of the NATO doctrine. You can't continue to violate NATO airspace. You can't threaten with bombs. You can't threaten with tactical nukes. If you do, first of all, tactical nukes, that's a red line for China. So you're going to lose your biggest ally. But secondly, you are getting dangerously close to invoking Article 5 that will bring the full weight and power of that. The one thing that the president-elect did tell Putin was not to escalate, which he didn't do, but we have a very strong military presence in Europe, and you know this. A tactical nuke would, again, China would abandon, and who knows where the radioactive cloud would. It's got two directions it can go. It can go into Russia and kill its own people, or it can go west and into Poland, which I would argue would be a violation of it would invoke Article 5.
You mentioned possible use of nukes. One thing Putin has done well as he's waged this revisionist campaign against us and our interests since at least the cyber attack on Estonia in 07 and the war on Georgia in 08, has been to read Western leaders. And he's found them wanting, or from his standpoint, amenable to his aggression because they're weak. It seems clear that one of the reasons why the current administration, has been slow in giving Ukraine the arms it needs and the permission to use those arms has been the fear of Putin's nuclear threats, even though we passed 6 or 7 Russian red lines. We're now hearing similar arguments coming from parts of, not the incoming administration, but parts of the incoming party. Why this weird synergy between the one clear weakness in the Biden administration and people who want to make America strong again?
I find it very strange. I can't explain it. I suppose there's an isolationist wing within my party that possibly existed in the 1930s, and they were on the wrong side of history. When I saw the refugees coming out of Ukraine into Poland, the mothers and children and their fathers were left to fight the war, they said this is like 1939, all over again. I asked this very question of the analyst yesterday in a different setting, but I can tell you that their analysis is this is bluster. It's been bluster from day one, that they know the consequences of using a tactical nuke. And quite frankly, from a military standpoint, it wouldn't do the damage that other weapons could do. But the damage it would incur to Russia would be they would lose face in the process. They would lose allies, and they could potentially invoke Article 5. And for all those reasons, that's why I just don't think they would do it. They will continue their cyber attacks. So the more you put Russia on the doorstep of Eastern Europe, the more you're going to see threats to Europe. Europe is almost like two different Europes. You got Eastern Europe and Western. And I'll put the UK in a different category. But if you look at Germany, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, I asked the ambassador at the time, why do you want to have a pipeline from Russia that's going to make you dependent on Russian energy? Well, we want Russia to be more of a trading partner, and we feel there was also a bit of consciousness guilt about World War II. And we saw how well Nord Stream 2 worked. So if you talk to Eastern Europe, they're very hardline against Russia. Whereas Western Europe is a little, to your point, leadership's a little weaker. And it's because they're not on the front line. And the UK is in a different spot. I think they're very much our ally in this fight. And I passed AUKUS in the Congress, which unifies Australia, UK, and the United States in an alignment to counter China in the Indo-Pacific.
We've got 3 minutes before audience questions, but there's one large issue we have to raise. You talk about history, and the Spanish Civil War was kind of a preview of World War II in Europe. And you might say that Russia's aggression in Ukraine could be a preview of a great power war to come. And one thing our military has learned from this war is how equipment intensive a great power war would be. The U.S. has not paid nearly enough attention to ramping up its arms production. Even since the big invasion, the steps forward have been relatively slow. How do you see this playing out? Are we going to get serious about returning the arsenal of democracy into operation?
I love that term, arsenal of democracy. If I go home and say, the biggest threat to the United States is our defense industrial base, they don't know what I'm talking about. But if I say the arsenal of democracy, they understand that.
Yes.
And that is our greatest threat and weakness. And it's not because of the weapons going into Ukraine. Those are older weapons. A lot of them are Russian from Eastern Europe. I'll give you an example. I sign off on all foreign military weapon sales. We promised Taiwan 5 years ago 20 weapon systems. They bought them. It's not like we're financing it. They actually paid for them. Only half of those weapon systems now have gone into Taiwan. Now, That's indicative of a global problem. And we need to change the way our procurement process works at the DoD, but we also need to change our defense contractors to be more agile and flexible with cost, not cost plus, but fixed, contracts. A good example, I'm not trying to favor one over the other, but Androl is a very innovative company that anticipate what the customer wants, and they build it and the customer buys it. When I was in Australia, there was the Ghost Shark. It's about 25, 30 feet. It's a platform, AI, unmanned, electric, so there's no signature, and it can develop sea mines, torpedoes, drones, and missiles, all from one platform, either underwater or on the surface. How many of those would secure the Taiwan Straits, I asked? Probably 6 to 8.
Interesting.
And I said, how much do they cost? $10 to $20 million. Now, that may sound a lot like a lot of money to y'all, but that's, as you know, Ambassador, that's hard. And imagine, this is Chairman Xi's greatest fear is AUKUS, because the beast of the ocean, the nuclear subs are rotating in, and now he knows that we're on the verge of AI weapon systems like this that could go all throughout the Pacific.
Okay, thank you. But one more quick question here. Some naive individuals who don't understand the Russian threat to the United States say, well, because China is the larger threat and we have a limited supply of weapons, we need to send them all to the Western Pacific. Your thoughts? They talk about increasing production.
They're all in it together. When I gave my closing argument on the emergency wartime supplemental, I had a picture. There they were, all four. There was a picture of Putin and Chairman Xi and the Ayatollah and Kim Jong-un all at the same party. They are the same party, actually. And they're all in it together. You cannot separate them. What happens in Ukraine will forecast the Indo-Pacific. Why I worry about the Indo-Pacific even more so is that imagine Taiwan invasion and 90% of our advanced semiconductor manufacturing goes under the tailspin that would create economically, which is why I introduced and passed, the CHIPS Act. But what else will happen if, let's say, a miscalculation in the Philippines, where I just came back, where the Chinese warships are violating Philippine territorial waters, and the Chinese yell at us in Mandarin to go back, turn around, go home, Yankee, right? So, but imagine a miscalculation. We have a defense agreement with the Philippines. That would escalate into, my God, the United States and the Philippines are at war with China. Who's going to join China? Who are the allies of China? Russia, Iran, and North Korea against the United States, Australia, UK, Japan, South Korea, Philippines. That would be the World War III scenario.
And we've been making progress, am I wrong, with NATO, getting them to engage in the Pacific?
Right, and I the National Security Advisor from Japan calls it, we need a new NATO. Well, some in my party don't like that word, but there's an alliance. And I will credit this administration for the treaty between, who would think Japan and the Philippines and South Korea would ever enter into a defense agreement? Now Vietnam is on the verge, and Indonesia, and Australia. And when I'm over in the island nations, you know what they tell me? China, they're not doing themselves any favors. They are creating more enemies than anything else because of their aggression. Correct. They see the threat from China, and they are fearful, and they want to stick together, in this alliance, whatever you want to call it.
As long as we're strong, that works really nicely.
And it's the will, if I get in with that, the will of the American people is going to be key, right? So we have an agreement with the Philippines that we are really mandated to oblige ourselves. Taiwan's different. And some people will say, why do we care about an island off the coast of China? Why is Taiwan important? Well, it's the aggression that would come after that. But if they don't care about freedom and democracy, like when I was growing up under Reagan, and they don't seem to care about freedom and democracy as much, but I can tell them it's going to hit your pocketbook. You won't be able to drive your car. You won't have semiconductor chips. because 90% of those are manufactured in Taiwan, and you will have an economic tailspin.
Okay, I'm scrolling through the questions. I'll take a question from Anonymous because it's most relevant to what you've just been discussing. Given the administration, the incoming administration's interest in this peace negotiation, some worry about what the terms of that settlement might be and the process to get there. How can Congress, which has demonstrated large bipartisan support for aiding Ukraine, ensure Ukraine continues to receive resources necessary to defend itself?
Well, Mr. Meeks and I are from different parties, but we're very unified. And that's the only way this works. You'll have fringes on the left and the right that will never vote for Ukraine. But it's the members in the middle, the sensible center. I'm kind of more center right, they're more center left, that will bring this coalition together. I've never seen, and it was really the work of myself with the speaker and Mr. Meeks with Joaquin Jeffries, to get a rule passed on Ukraine required us to get 60 or more Democrats to vote for a Republican rule. Now that's unheard of,
right?
But it happened in Ukraine on that vote. And that's the only way. In our committee, we try to be bipartisan, and when we're not, we disagree civilly. But we don't want to be divided, because it's always stronger as one nation, one voice. Our adversaries listen. When we're divided as a committee or a nation, our adversaries and enemies see weakness. So this is like incredibly important that we stick together on this.
Amen. Okay, we have a question from Sangmin Lee from Radio Free Asia. How can the U.S. respond, how should the U.S. respond to the North Korean troops in Russia fighting Ukrainians? And maybe entering Ukraine?
Well, the ATACMS.
Right? That's a good thing?
I mean, the ATACMS will hit them hard. Now, these are kind of their special forces, but the ATACMS can hit them. It was interesting, we got a report that one of their own drones, actually, they didn't know how to use it. It landed on them and blew up a lot of North Koreans. Not to celebrate anyone's departure, but they're not fully integrated with the Russians. They don't speak the same language. They're not trained. I think, and I always try to see the light in a dark situation. This is creating a division between Russia and China, because China, they don't like the fact that now North Korea is putting troops in there. Why are they doing it? Because they want Russia to help them against this UN, denuclearization agreement that the UN's pushing for with North Korea. That's precisely why they're putting those troops in there. And they're getting money.
Do you think that North Korea is getting help with missile technology from Moscow?
Yes. And I would also say, but for China, Russian military was decimated, but for China, they were resuscitated. And they rebuilt their military because of China. And I've told this administration and Mr. Sullivan, National Security Council, please apply secondary sanctions on China, because they are rebuilding the Russian military. And if I could elaborate,
please.
2 very strong sanctions I wrote into, including ATACMS. I didn't say may be delivered, shall be delivered, mandatory language, because I knew that they wouldn't do it unless Congress mandated the ATACMS. And then, even though we mandate, they said, well, we're not going to let them use it, in these areas. That's gotten better. But the other thing, 2 things we did was on Iran. China's buying Iranian oil to the tune of about $100 billion. What's that doing? That's funding their terror operations in the Middle East. But what else are they doing? They're sending their drones and missiles that they fired into Israel, same ones, they're shipping those to Russia, that then Russia uses to kill Ukrainians. Well, those sanctions were allowed to expire. So I put them back in to the emergency wartime supplemental, but they're not being enforced. Why in the world are we not enforcing sanctions that would dry up Iran's funding and prohibit weapon sales that kill Israelis and kill Ukrainians.
Amen. Okay. I have a question from Laura Kelly on the Hill. You're stepping down from the chairmanship. What advice do you have for whomever takes your place?
God help you. Well, I feel, our rules, we get term limited, but
Right.
the rules actually work to my benefit. I'm one of the rare members that's actually chaired two important committees, Homeland Security at a very dangerous time after 9/11, and then now Foreign Affairs as I see the world's on fire. Now, I wasn't a direct cause and effect for these things, but I just happened to chair at a very critical time. So I'm liberated from the shackles of management, but I will not be bound. I will be actually have a little bit of freedom to speak my own mind. I think a chair is going to be bound by whatever comes out of the White House. And while I certainly support most of those ideas, I will have some freedom and flexibility to speak my own mind and to try to influence and persuade people. And I think I will be given a role, and I never thought of myself as an older person, but as a sort of maybe not senior statesman, but maybe a little bit older statesman in the Congress that my colleagues will listen to, that I can provide leadership to in a different role, and I'll have more time to do things like this. I'll have more time to write. I'm very much looking forward to this new role in the next Congress.
Well, your voice certainly carries.
Thank you.
We have several questions on Georgia. One about the obviously imperfect, if not fraudulent, election. Two about the intent, it seems, by the current leader in Georgia to push the country closer to Moscow.
Yeah.
And basically all asking what can and should the United States do to prevent an end to democracy in Georgia and an end to an ally to the West in the Caucasus.
Well, it's a huge issue. In fact, Leslie Shedd, my comms director, went over and was one of the election watchers. They're mandated to vote in Georgia. Maybe that's not a bad idea here. You get fined if you don't vote. Now, how can you explain, why would they elect a pro-Russian president? Fraud probably is part of it, but there's also a sentiment in Georgia that we don't want to poke the bear, literally. If we have someone that's sort of friendly to Moscow, they're not going to annex us. They'll give us some space. I'm not justifying that thinking. I think that's their sort of thinking as they're on the doorstep of an invasion, which would certainly happen if Ukraine fell. And I really feel for the people in Moldova. They know that they are going to be the first victim to fall if Ukraine falls. But democracy is under threat. Everywhere Russia, all the borders of Russia, there's a threat to democracy.
Okay, last question from Doug Klain with Rosam. The Biden administration has pledged to make full use of available drawdown authority by the end of its term. There are reports that some, or more than some, of military assistance won't arrive until well into the next year, into the new administration. What does President Biden do? What can he do to fix this while he has 2 months in office?
I actually agree with pulling down the drawdown authority and utilizing that now so that no one can take that away. That was the intent and will of Congress. So just like the weapons were, give it to Ukraine. Don't hold it back. Personally, I know the loans is a big issue, but, World War II, we had Lend-Lease, and we forgave a lot of loans to the UK, and I think we'll do the same thing, with Ukraine. And then I think there will be an intense debate. I can't lie about this, or I certainly want to be honest, that there will be a very intense debate in the new Congress. Now, this is getting in the weeds of how Congress, either we'll have a CR, continuing resolution at the end of the year, which is terrible for the military, or we'll have a full spending, a minibus or omnibus. Either way, that'll happen either in December or March 1st. That would be the length of the CR. And that's when the debate on additional funding, for Ukraine, will come up. We can't afford to lose this fight. And NATO, in many respects, I think is stronger today because of the 2% that President Trump mandated. But they're also very strong. We went to the NATO conference. What was Putin's response to that? He intentionally fired a missile and hit a children's hospital the day before the NATO conference. Shot across the bow.
Correct.
That shows you how evil this man is.
And no response from NATO or the United States to
No
that
response.
provocation.
And shameful. I think NATO and the will of NATO in Europe is in many respects stronger on Ukraine than the United States is.
Yes. Well, I think our time is up. It's been a real pleasure having this conversation with you, Mr. Chairman. And we'll be happy to invite you back when you have freed of those responsibilities. Okay, thank
Thanks
you very
for your
much.
service.